Now I'd like to introduce Shelby Phillips, who worked with us for a couple of years. She's also kind of in charge of what's happening with your children next door. But she's going to talk to us about genetics and kind of overall genetics of epilepsy and what we're thinking about sunflower. Thanks, Shelby.
Hello, yes, so I'm Shelby. I've worked here with Dr. Teal's clinic for 2 years now. I'm a community health worker in her office, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the overview of genetic disorders with a focus on epilepsy. So I first wanted to start with an analogy about genetics. So how a lot of people like to view it is like reading a book. All of us here in this room are made up of DNA, and when you think about a book, the book has all of the information that we need, and that's referred to as the genome when you're thinking about genetics and your DNA. And then when you look at a book, it's typically broken down by chapters. So the chapters can be our chromosomes, which has very organized DNA. And then when you read the chapters, it has a lot of letters involved in it. And you can't read the chapters if there are no spaces in between the letters. So I was thinking that our DNA code is like no spaces between things. So it'd be really hard to read. But when you look at the gene, you can see I split up the spaces and it says the cat chased the mouse. So that's kind of my analogy for when we're looking at genes, we know exactly what letters make those up. And how do we know that? In 2003, there was a research project called the Human Genome Project, where they sequenced our whole genome in humans. And that was able to let us know what letters correspond with which gene. And the reason why I'm talking about that is because when we think about what is a genetic disorder is often defined as a medical condition where there's a change in the DNA sequence of a gene. And one example, so if we think back to the book analogy of if there's a typo in our book, instead of the cat chased the mouse, it becomes the car chased the mouse. And that little change of one letter doesn't always mean that you're going to have a genetic disorder. You won't. It doesn't always mean that something bad will happen, but sometimes it does result in a genetic disorder. And I just wanted to give an example of a genetic disorder that you might be familiar with. It's called Huntington's disease, and for that, it's just a series of repeating letters of CAG. So that's kind of just my introduction to genetics a little bit, and then now we'll transition to genetics and epilepsy. So we know that about 50% of people who have no known cause for epilepsy, they might be able to find a gene that's responsible for their epilepsy. That's not always the case, and there's different types of testing, which I'll talk about later. And so what I wanted to talk about what might inspire or what might cause a family to pursue genetic testing. So for some families, if they don't have a family member who has epilepsy, that might be a reason why they want to get tested. Maybe they want to see if there's something that can be identified. And then some people have hard to treat epilepsy, so medications do not help reduce their seizure frequency, or there are other treatments for epilepsy that might not be helping reduce their seizure frequency, so they might want to see is there something genetic that could be causing this. Then another reason people pursue genetic testing is because some companies will offer free testing to you if you're under a certain age. So that's usually another reason. If there's a clinical indication for it, then some families will opt to do that. So what are the genetic testing options? There's usually 3 different routes you can go. There's an epilepsy panel, which will scan a limited number of genes in the DNA sequence for changes in a DNA sequence. And so those panels will usually look at 100 to 320 genes that have been associated with epilepsy. So whenever you get genetic testing done, that mutation that comes back positive will go in a database. It doesn't have any information about your name, but they'll keep that information and what your signs and symptoms were, and then they're able to kind of collate that together and be like, okay, this gene has been associated with people who have epilepsy, so this is a part of the panel. Another test that you might do, and these last two tests are more expensive because they cover more genes. So there's whole exome sequencing, which will look at about 22,000 genes, and those genes all code for a protein. And then there's whole genome sequencing, which looks at all of your genetic information. And then, so what do we know about sunflower syndrome? So to date, you might have already heard this today. I've been with the kids, so I don't know. But we've met 120 people living with sunflower syndrome, and we're gathering information about like what their backgrounds are, like do they have family members with seizures, etc. So we found that 37 people that we've met, they only have the hand-waving seizures, whereas there are 47 people we've met who also have had a tonic-clonic seizure in their lifetime. And then there are 8 people who have had an absence seizure in addition to their hand-waving seizures. And then 2 people have had myoclonic seizures. And then there are 49 individuals who have a family member who has a history of epilepsy. And we're still trying to figure out if there are any patterns in any of this. And for genetic testing, I looked at how many people we've had genetic testing results for, and these are some genes that have come back positive. And really what I want to highlight with this slide is that we haven't really had any duplicate genes. Like we haven't really had like 2 patients or 3 patients test positive for a mutation in the same gene. It's been different all around. And the genes that are here with the asterisk, it just means they were marked as pathogenic, which means that they think that's like the mutation in that gene could likely be why they have the symptoms that they have. But yeah, so thinking about sunflower syndrome, it's not one specific gene, and we don't exactly know what it could be playing a role in this. But what we do know is that sunflower syndrome has some similarities to other epilepsies. So the EEGs of individuals with sunflower syndrome look similar to individuals who have juvenile myoclonic epilepsy and childhood absence epilepsy while the seizure is occurring. And then all 3 epilepsies, the similarity between them is that they're characterized as a generalized epilepsy, which often starts during childhood. And then similar to sunflower syndrome, those other 2 epilepsies aren't really linked to one specific gene either. And so it's possible there might be a genetic relationship there, but we don't know. So my conclusions for my talk today is that there's not one gene associated with sunflower syndrome, and there's still a lot more to learn, and that's what we're committed to doing here. And we'll always share that information with you whenever we can. And access to genetic testing might help us learn more about sunflower syndrome, and also improvements to genetic technologies would help us learn more, hopefully one day. And then these are my references, and thank you. This is our team when we were at a Walk for Epilepsy for epilepsy advocacy and awareness, and thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. We're going to do questions later.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Awesome.
Brilliant. Shelby, thanks. And again, we'll all be around kind of for the afternoon for questions.